Everyone froze the moment the little girl let go of her father's hand and ran straight past every important guest in that ballroom, past the mayor, past the bank executives, past 3 grown women in $10,000 dresses, and threw her arms around the housekeeper, standing quietly by the kitchen doors with a tray still balanced on her hip. Somebody laughed first, then another. And the whole room was laughing, that tight, uncomfortable laugh rich people use when they don't know whether to be amused or embarrassed. Nobody in that ballroom knew that in exactly 11 days, the man who owned the house would stand in front of every one of them and admit that the woman they were laughing at was the only person who had ever actually raised his daughter. Stay with me, because what happens next is going to make you look differently at every person you've ever walked past without seeing. Grant Calloway built his fortune the way most men in his position do, by working when everyone else went home. He owned 4 hotels along the East Coast, a logistics company nobody outside finance had heard of, and a name that opened doors in rooms most people never got invited into. He also owned a very large house outside Boston with too many windows and not nearly enough warmth, and inside that house lived his 7-year-old daughter, Josie, a girl with her mother's eyes and a stillness about her that made adults uneasy, the kind of stillness that comes from a child who has learned far too early that people leave. Josie's mother had died 2 years earlier, a car accident on an icy road in February, the kind of ordinary tragedy that rearranges a family overnight and never fully lets go. Grant had thrown himself into work the way grieving men often do, mistaking exhaustion for healing. He hired the best people money could buy, a rotating cast of nannies with Ivy League credentials, tutors flown in from Europe, a therapist who came twice a week and left with a check and very little to show for it. Everyone did their job well. Nobody stayed long enough to matter. The mother, a woman named Claire, had been the one who filled that house with noise before she died, the one who insisted on family dinners even when Grant's schedule made them nearly impossible, the one who used to sit on the edge of Josie's bed every night, doing the same silly voices for the same 3 picture books until Josie could recite them by heart. When the accident happened, on a stretch of road not 2 miles from the elementary school, the entire architecture of that household collapsed overnight, and nobody, least of all Grant, knew how to rebuild it. He remembered almost nothing about the first month afterward, except an unbroken blur of funeral programs, sympathy casseroles nobody ate, and a 5-year-old who stopped speaking above a whisper for the better part of 6 weeks. He had been present in the house during all of it, technically, but presence and attention are not always the same thing, and grief has a way of making even a father feel like a stranger standing just outside the glass, watching his own child hurt without knowing how to reach her. Everyone except Odessa Marsh. Odessa had worked in the Calloway household for 6 years, first as part of the cleaning staff, later moving quietly into the role of housekeeper after the previous one retired. She was 58 years old, originally from a small town outside Charlotte, North Carolina. With 2 grown sons of her own and a grandson, she video-called every single night at 7 o'clock sharp, no matter what was happening in the house she worked in. She did not ask for attention. She did not compete for status among the staff. She simply showed up every day on time and did whatever the house needed, folding linens, managing the kitchen schedule, and somewhere along the way, without anyone officially assigning her the task, she became the person Josie ran to when something went wrong. Nobody had planned it that way. It had simply happened the way real things tend to happen, quietly and without permission. The gala that night was meant to celebrate the opening of Grant's 5th hotel, a glass tower going up in downtown Boston that had taken 3 years and considerable political maneuvering to get approved. 200 guests filled the Calloway Estates ballroom, investors and city council members, and the kind of socialites who show up to be photographed rather than to celebrate anything in particular. Josie had been dressed for the occasion in a pale blue gown, her hair curled and pinned by a stylist Grant had hired for the evening, and for 20 minutes she stood beside her father, shaking hands she didn't want to shake, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then Odessa walked through the far doorway, carrying a tray of appetizers toward the kitchen, still in her work uniform because someone in catering had fallen through at the last minute, and she'd stepped in without complaint, the way she always did. Josie saw her before anyone else did, and without a word to her father, without a glance back, she pulled her hand free and ran. The room noticed instantly, because rich rooms notice everything. A little girl in a designer gown, barefoot by then, because she'd kicked off her shoes somewhere near the dessert table, sprinting across marble floors toward a woman holding a serving tray. Odessa barely had time to set the tray down before Josie collided into her, arms wrapped around her waist, face buried in her apron. For a moment, everything in that ballroom seemed to hold perfectly still, the string quartet in the corner still playing, waiters still frozen mid-step with trays of champagne, 200 conversations pausing at once the way a room does when something unscripted happens in the middle of something carefully staged. Odessa's tray tilted dangerously for a second before she caught it, setting it down on the nearest surface just in time to catch the small body colliding into her. The laughter started almost immediately. Not cruel exactly, at least not at first, more the reflexive laughter of people caught off guard by something that didn't fit the evening's choreography. A councilman chuckled and murmured something to his wife about how sweet it was that the little one was fond of the help. A woman near the bar raised an eyebrow and said, loud enough for several people to hear, that someone should really teach that child the difference between family and staff. Grant felt his face go hot, not from anger at his daughter, from something harder to name, a mixture of embarrassment and confusion, and a flicker of something underneath both of those things that he wouldn't be able to identify until much later. He crossed the room quickly, the smile he wore for cameras still stitched onto his face. Josie, he said quietly, kneeling down beside her. Sweetheart, you can't just run off like that. Josie didn't let go. I wanted to see Miss Odessa, she said, her voice muffled against the apron. You'll see her later, Grant said. Right now we have guests. Odessa, to her credit, was already gently peeling the small arms from around her waist, murmuring something soft about how Josie needed to go back to her daddy and be a good hostess. She kept her eyes down the entire time, the practiced posture of someone who had spent a career understanding exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in a room like this one. Josie went, but not without one last look back, the kind of look that said clearly she'd rather be anywhere else. For the rest of the evening, Grant found himself distracted. He shook the hands he needed to shake. He gave the toast he'd rehearsed. He laughed at the right moments and thanked the right people, but somewhere underneath all of it, a question had lodged itself and refused to leave. Why had his daughter run to the housekeeper instead of to him? He told himself it didn't mean anything. Children get attached to whoever spends the most time with them, he reasoned, and Odessa did spend a great deal of time in that house. It was proximity, nothing more. He almost believed it too, until 3 nights later when Josie woke screaming from a nightmare and the first name out of her mouth wasn't his. He'd been the one to hear her that night, actually, his office being closer to her room than usual, because he'd fallen asleep at his desk again reviewing hotel permits. He ran down the hall and found her sitting straight up in bed, drenched in sweat, sobbing in that particular way children sob when the fear hasn't fully released its grip yet. He sat beside her, pulled her close, told her he was there, that everything was fine. She let him hold her for a moment. Then she pulled back and asked, through tears, if someone could get Miss Odessa. Grant felt something crack quietly in his chest. I'm right here, baby, he said. I've got you. I know, Josie whispered, but she knows how to make it stop. He didn't call for Odessa that night. He stayed with his daughter himself, rubbing her back until she fell back asleep, counting her breaths the way he used to count Claire's on nights she couldn't sleep. And he told himself there was proof enough that he could do this, that he didn't need anyone else's help raising his own child. He sat there long after Josie had drifted off, watching the small rise and fall of her shoulders, thinking about how easy it had once been, before the accident, to believe that love alone was enough to keep a child safe, and how much harder that belief had become to hold on to once he understood that love without presence was just a feeling with nowhere to land. But sleep didn't come easily for him that night, and around 3 in the morning, he found himself standing in the hallway outside Josie's room, staring at nothing in particular, turning over a memory he'd been avoiding for 2 years. The memory was of the week after the funeral. Grant had been so consumed by grief and logistics, funeral arrangements, sympathy calls, a company that still needed running even while his world fell apart, that he'd barely registered the days passing. Josie, only 5 at the time, had stopped eating almost entirely, and nobody could coax more than a few bites into her. It was Odessa who had noticed. Odessa who had quietly started making the child's favorite foods without being asked. Odessa who had sat with her at the kitchen table every night for 2 weeks, not talking, not forcing anything, just sitting there until Josie finally picked up a spoon on her own. Grant remembered walking past the kitchen one of those nights and seeing them there together, and he remembered feeling a distant gratitude he never properly expressed, because he was too busy surviving his own grief to notice hers being tended by someone else. He hadn't thought about it in a long time. Now it wouldn't leave him alone. The following week, Grant's sister Diane came to visit from Manhattan, the kind of visit that always came wrapped in unsolicited opinions about how he was raising his daughter. Diane had never particularly warmed to staff, treating household employees with the brisk efficiency of someone managing inventory rather than people, and it took her exactly one afternoon to notice the dynamic between Josie and Odessa. "You need to fix this," Diane said over coffee in the sunroom, watching through the window as Josie helped Odessa hang laundry in the yard, the two of them laughing about something neither adult could hear. "It's not healthy, a child treating the housekeeper like a mother figure." "She's not treating her like anything," Grant said, more defensively than he intended. "She's fond of her, that's all." Diane set down her cup. "Grant," she said carefully, "people talk. Do you understand what it looks like? A little white girl from a family like ours running to the black woman who cleans the house every time something goes wrong, instead of to any of the family around her. It's not a good look. And frankly, it's not fair to Odessa either. That woman has her own life. She shouldn't be expected to be a substitute mother on top of her actual job." Grant didn't have an answer for that, not right away. Part of him wanted to dismiss it outright, but another part, the part that had been unsettled since the gala, wondered if his sister had accidentally said something true buried inside something unkind. Maybe it wasn't fair to Odessa. Maybe he had been quietly leaning on her without ever formally acknowledging what she'd become in his daughter's life, without paying her for the invisible hours she spent being exactly what Josie needed and he couldn't manage to be. Before he went looking for Odessa that evening, Grant did something almost clinical, the kind of thing a man does when he's trying to make an emotional decision feel rational. He asked human resources to pull her personnel file, telling himself he simply wanted to understand her history in the household before making any decisions about her future in it. The file that landed on his desk an hour later was thin, remarkably thin for someone who had worked for his family for 6 years. Excellent attendance, no disciplinary actions, a pay rate that hadn't moved much beyond cost of living adjustments since she'd been promoted to housekeeper. No notes about the 2 years she'd spent quietly holding his daughter together while he worked 80-hour weeks. No line item for showing up during thunderstorms or learning to braid hair from videos on her phone or sitting at a kitchen table until a grieving child finally picked up a spoon. Some things, he realized, staring at that folder, simply don't fit on a form, and the fact that they didn't fit had let him underpay and undervalue the most important relationship in his daughter's life for 2 straight years without ever noticing. He also found, buried near the back of the folder, a copy of Odessa's original job application from 6 years earlier, and something in her handwritten answer to the question about why she wanted the position stopped him cold. She had written, in careful, deliberate handwriting, that she'd raised 2 boys on her own after her husband passed, that she knew what it meant for a household to lose its center, and that she believed every child, regardless of the family's income, deserved somebody steady in their corner. She had written that 6 years before Claire ever died, 6 years before anyone in that house needed exactly what she was offering. It read less like a job application and more like a promise she hadn't known, yet she'd be asked to keep. That night he found Odessa in the kitchen, finishing the dinner dishes, and for the first time in 6 years, he actually sat down and asked her about her life. Not as her employer checking in on staff morale, but as one person genuinely curious about another. Odessa was startled by the question at first, and it took her a moment to answer honestly. She told him about her sons, one an electrician in Raleigh, the other still finding his footing after a rough few years, about her grandson who was obsessed with dinosaurs and called her every night to tell her a new fact he'd learned, about her late husband who had passed 11 years earlier from a heart condition nobody caught in time. She told him carefully that she'd taken this job because the pay was good and the hours were steady, and that she had never once set out to become anything more to Josie than a friendly face in the house. It just happened, she said quietly, wringing a dish towel in her hands. She was so lost after her mama passed, Mr. Calloway. I wasn't trying to take anyone's place. I just couldn't watch a child hurt like that and do nothing. Grant sat with that for a long moment. I know, he finally said. I think I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit what it meant. What does it mean? She asked, her voice careful, guarded in the way people are when they sense a conversation could cost them something. It means, Grant said slowly, that you've been doing a job I should have found a way to do myself, and instead of thanking you properly, I let my sister imply you were somehow inappropriate for it. Odessa didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. Her expression said enough. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the house, though not smoothly and not without friction. Grant began coming home earlier, some nights at least, trying to insert himself back into the small rituals of his daughter's life, bath time, bedtime stories, the mundane conversations about school and friends that he'd outsourced without meaning to. Josie was glad to have him there, but she didn't stop reaching for Odessa either, and Grant slowly came to understand that this wasn't a competition he needed to win. It wasn't him or Odessa. It could be both. Diane, however, hadn't finished making her opinions known. At a family dinner 3 weeks after the gala, with Grant's parents visiting from Florida, the subject came up again, less delicately this time. Grant's father, a retired judge with old-fashioned notions about household hierarchy, remarked that it was one thing for staff to be kind to a grieving child, and another thing entirely for a father to let boundaries blur to the point where the housekeeper was being treated like family at the dinner table. A comment prompted by the fact that Odessa had joined them for dessert that evening at Josie's insistence. Grant felt the old instinct to smooth things over, to defer to his father's judgment the way he always had growing up. But he looked across the table at Odessa, who had gone very still and very quiet, her eyes fixed on her plate, and he looked at Josie, who had reached over without thinking and taken Odessa's hand under the table, and something in him refused to let this moment pass the way it always had before. "Dad," he said, with more steadiness than he felt, "I'd ask you not to talk about her like she isn't sitting right here." The table went quiet. His mother shifted uncomfortably. His father's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to disrespect anyone," his father said stiffly. "I'm simply saying there are appropriate boundaries in a household, and you do well to remember them, for everyone's sake, including hers." Grant shook his head slowly. "The only boundary that's mattered in this house for the last 2 years is the one between the people who showed up for my daughter and the people who didn't," he said. "And I think we all know which side of that boundary most of us have been standing on." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Odessa finally looked up, her eyes glassy, and quietly excused herself from the table, saying she needed to check on something in the kitchen. Josie moved to follow her, but Grant gently stopped her, telling her to give Miss Odessa a minute, and instead he got up himself and followed her into the kitchen. He found her standing at the sink, not doing anything in particular, just standing there with her hands braced against the counter, breathing slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. "That should never have happened at my table." Odessa didn't turn around right away. "It's all right, Mr. Calloway," she said softly. "I've heard worse. You get used to it." "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You shouldn't have to get used to it. Not in this house, not from my own family." She turned to face him then, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something other than composure in her expression, something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of someone who has spent years being careful, being grateful, being small enough not to threaten anyone's comfort. "Can I tell you something?" she said, and he nodded. "I love that little girl like she's my own. I have loved her since the day her mama died, and she looked at me like I was the only solid thing left standing in that house. But I also know exactly what I am here. I'm the housekeeper, and no matter how much love passes between me and that child, there's always going to be somebody at a table, somewhere reminding me not to forget it." Grant stood there absorbing that for a long moment, feeling the full weight of every year he hadn't noticed, every dinner he hadn't attended, every night Odessa had quietly stepped into a gap he'd left open without ever asking to be thanked or acknowledged for it. "What if I told you I wanted to change that?" he said finally. Odessa raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Change what exactly?" "Your position," he said. Odessa was quiet for a moment, and Grant realized, watching her, that she hadn't actually said yes yet, that whatever he was about to offer wasn't a foregone conclusion just because he'd finally decided to offer it. "Before you go any further," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I have 2 sons of my own. I have a life outside this house, a church I sing in on Sundays, a mother in Charlotte I drive down to see every few months. If I say yes to whatever you're about to say, I need to know it's not going to swallow up the rest of my life. I love that little girl, but loving her can't mean disappearing into this family and losing everything else I am." Grant hadn't considered that, and he was grateful she'd said it plainly instead of letting him assume otherwise. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair. Whatever this looks like, it has to work for your life too, not just ours. Tell me what you need." She thought about it for a long moment, and then slowly, cautiously, she started talking about wanting real weekends, about wanting the flexibility to visit her mother without asking permission, about wanting her sons to feel welcome in this house rather than treated as an inconvenience if they ever needed to visit. Grant agreed to every condition without hesitation, and something about the ease of that agreement seemed to loosen something in her that had been braced for disappointment. "I've been let down by families like yours before," she admitted quietly. "Good people mostly, but good people forget, once things are comfortable again, that the person who held everything together has needs too." "I won't forget," Grant said. "I've done enough forgetting these last 2 years. I don't have any left in me." "Your position," he said, "officially, not housekeeper who happens to look after my daughter on the side. Josie's guardian and caretaker formally, with the salary and the recognition that should have come with it 2 years ago, and a seat at every table in this house, permanently, no exceptions, no discussion." Odessa was quiet for a long time. "Your family isn't going to like that," she finally said. "My family," Grant said, "hasn't earned a vote in this decision. You have. You earned it the night you sat with my daughter at that kitchen table until she finally ate something. You earned it every night since, whether anyone was paying attention or not. I'm just finally catching up." Before any of that could happen, though, Diane made one final attempt to steer things in a different direction, and it came in a form Grant hadn't anticipated. Without asking him first, she arranged for 3 childcare specialists to fly in from New York, women with doctorates in developmental psychology, references from families whose last names appeared regularly in business magazines, and portfolios thick enough to double as briefcases. She framed it as a favor, a chance for Grant to see his options clearly before making an emotional decision he might regret. Grant, still raw from the dinner table confrontation with his father, agreed mostly to keep the peace, telling himself it couldn't hurt to listen. The 3 women arrived on a Saturday morning, dressed almost identically, tailored blazers, quiet jewelry, the kind of composed professionalism that photographed well. They sat in the Calloway living room with folders open on their laps, each one outlining a philosophy of childhood development, structured routines, enrichment activities, credentialed curricula designed to prepare a girl like Josie for the kind of future her father's name all but guaranteed her. Grant listened politely. Josie sat beside him on the couch, quiet, watching the 3 strangers with the wary stillness she reserved for people she hadn't decided about yet. The first woman, a specialist named Dr. Ferris, spoke at length about attachment theory and the importance of consistent, credentialed caregiving, gently suggesting that a child's over-reliance on domestic staff, however well-intentioned, could create confusion about household roles that might affect her emotional development later in life. She said this evenly, professionally, without any apparent malice, and yet Grant felt his jaw tighten at the phrasing, at the word staff doing so much quiet work in that sentence. Josie, who had been mostly silent through the presentations, finally spoke. "Is Miss Odessa going to be here for this?" she asked. Dr. Ferris smiled the practiced smile of someone accustomed to redirecting children gently. "This conversation is really for the grown-ups, sweetheart," she said. Josie looked at her father. "Why isn't she here?" she asked again, and there was an edge to it now, something Grant recognized because he'd been feeling it himself all morning. "Because your aunt set this meeting up without her," Grant admitted, and something in him decided, right there, that the meeting was already over even though nobody else in the room seemed to know it yet. The second specialist, sensing the room shifting, tried a different approach, pulling out a binder of testimonials from families she'd worked with, describing a structured 6-month transition plan that would gradually introduce a credentialed caregiver while easing the household away from what she diplomatically called informal attachments. Josie's foot had started bouncing under the coffee table, a habit Grant recognized from the weeks right after Claire died, when his daughter's whole body seemed to be holding something in that her voice wouldn't say. "Can I ask a question?" Josie said, and the specialist nodded encouragingly. "When my mom died," Josie continued, her voice steady in a way that startled everyone in the room, "I didn't eat for 2 weeks. Nobody could get me to eat. Did any of you know that?" The women exchanged a brief, uncertain glance. "No, sweetheart, we wouldn't have known that," Dr. Ferris said carefully. "Miss Odessa knew," Josie said. "She sat with me every night until I finally ate something. She didn't have a folder. She didn't have a plan. She just sat there." The third specialist, older than the other two and slightly less polished in her delivery, leaned forward with what seemed like genuine warmth. "That's a beautiful bond," she said, "and I don't doubt it's meaningful. But meaningful and sustainable aren't always the same thing, especially as you get older and your needs change. Structure matters. Credentials matter." Josie considered that for a long moment, the way she considered most things now, carefully, like she was turning a stone over in her hand to see every side of it. "Did any of you sit outside my door during a thunderstorm because I was scared of the noise?" she asked. "Did any of you learn to braid hair because I missed how my mom used to do it before school? Did any of you know I hate peas, but I'll eat them if they're mixed into rice, because that's how my mom used to make them?" Nobody answered, because nobody could. "That's not a credential you can put in a folder," Josie said quietly, "but it's the only one that ever mattered to me." Grant sat there absorbing his daughter's words, watching 3 highly qualified women fall silent in the face of a 7-year-old certainty, and he felt something settle firmly into place inside him, something that had been wavering for weeks, finally coming to rest. He thanked the women for their time, told them honestly that he respected their expertise and didn't doubt their skill, but that his daughter had just answered a question he'd been too afraid to ask directly for 2 years, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of politeness. After they left, Diane cornered him in the kitchen, exasperated. "You humiliated 3 of the most respected specialists on the East Coast," she said. "Grant, this is exactly the kind of impulsive decision I was worried about." "It wasn't impulsive," Grant said. "It was 2 years overdue. I just needed my daughter to say it out loud before I could admit I already knew it." It took another 2 weeks for the paperwork to be finalized, and Grant used part of that time to do something he probably should have done years earlier. He sat Josie down and asked her, gently, what she wanted, not leading her toward any particular answer, just genuinely asking his daughter what would make her feel safe. Josie's answer was simple, the way children's answers about the things that matter most usually are. "I just want her to stay," she said, "forever, not because it's her job, because she wants to." Grant made sure that when the announcement was made, it was made properly, not quietly, not apologetically. He invited the extended family back for dinner, the same table where his father had made his comment weeks earlier, and this time he stood at the head of it and told them plainly that Odessa Marsh was no longer the household's housekeeper. She was Josie's guardian, effective immediately, with full standing in this family, in this house, and at this table, and anyone who had a problem with that was welcome to finish their meal elsewhere. Nobody left. Nobody said a word, actually, not even his father, though the look on the old man's face suggested he was chewing on considerably more than his dinner. Diane, to her credit, apologized quietly to Odessa before the night was over, admitting that she'd let her own discomfort dress itself up as concern for boundaries that were never really about Odessa at all. Josie sat between her father and Odessa that night, looking, for the first time in longer than Grant could remember, entirely at peace, and somewhere in the middle of dinner, she reached over and took both of their hands at once, one on each side, and just held them there for a moment, as if she needed to feel that the two most important people in her world weren't going anywhere. Later, once the guests had left, and Josie had finally been coaxed to bed, Grant found himself sitting on the back porch with Odessa, the two of them watching the last bit of evening light fade over the yard where she used to hang laundry with his daughter. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For not giving up on her," he said. "For not giving up on either of us, honestly, because I know there were plenty of moments over these last 2 years where I made this harder than it needed to be." Odessa smiled, the first fully unguarded smile he'd seen from her in longer than he could remember. "I never once thought about giving up, Mr. Calloway," she said. "That little girl needed somebody to stay. I decided a long time ago that somebody was going to be me." Odessa was quiet for a while after that, watching the yard settle into darkness, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had a different quality to it, less guarded, more like someone thinking out loud for her own benefit rather than anyone else's. "You know," she said, "when I first took this job, I told myself it was just a paycheck. Steady work, decent people, a house to keep clean. I didn't let myself think past that because in my experience, families like yours don't usually want more from you than what's on the job description, and they definitely don't offer more than that in return. So I kept my head down. I did my work. And somewhere along the way, that little girl needed somebody, and I was the one standing closest, so I stayed. I didn't do it to be noticed. I did it because walking away wasn't something I knew how to do, not with a child looking at me like that." It occurred to Grant, sitting there in the fading light, that he had spent 2 years believing he needed to hire the right person to fix what was broken in his household, when the right person had been there the entire time, not because of a title or a resume, but because she showed up, day after day, in the small, unglamorous, unrewarded ways that never make it onto anyone's job description. He thought about all the people in his life who had impressive titles and polished credentials, and he thought about Odessa, standing quietly by the kitchen doors with a serving tray, and he understood, finally and completely, which one of those things had actually mattered. There was a moment, a few days after the announcement, when Grant overheard 2 of the household's remaining staff talking quietly in the hallway, unaware he was within earshot. One of them, a younger woman who'd been hired the previous year, said she couldn't imagine a family like the Calloways elevating someone the way they'd elevated Odessa, said it must have taken something extraordinary. The older woman she was speaking to, who had worked in the house nearly as long as Odessa had, simply laughed, not unkindly, and said that it hadn't taken anything extraordinary at all, only somebody finally noticing what had been true the entire time. Grant stood there in the hallway a moment longer than he needed to, letting that sentence settle over him before he continued on to find his daughter. Word got around, as it always does in circles like theirs, and in the weeks that followed, there were a few uncomfortable conversations at social events, a few raised eyebrows from people who thought they understood something about propriety that Grant no longer had any patience for. He stopped explaining himself. He stopped apologizing for a decision that had never needed defending in the first place. When people asked, and some of them did ask, directly and without much tact, why a man in his position had elevated the housekeeper to guardian of his only child, he found he only needed one answer. Because she stayed, he would say. Everyone else came and went. She stayed. That's the whole story. There was one more moment, smaller than the gala, smaller than the dinner table confrontation, that Grant would later say mattered more than almost anything else that happened that year. It came from Josie's second-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who requested a brief meeting a few weeks after the guardianship had been made official. Grant went in expecting to hear about a behavioral issue or a dip in grades, bracing himself the way parents do when a teacher asks to see them privately. Instead, Mrs. Alvarez slid a drawing across her desk, one Josie had made during a classroom assignment asking students to illustrate their family. The drawing showed three figures standing in front of a house with yellow-curtained windows, holding hands. Grant recognized himself immediately, tall, dark-haired, drawn a little stiffly, the way children draw the adults who work too much. Beside him stood Josie, small and grinning, and on her other side stood a woman with warm brown skin and a bun pinned neatly at the back of her head, wearing an apron Josie had carefully colored in with a purple crayon. Underneath, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, Josie had written 3 words, "My whole family." "I just wanted you to see this," Mrs. Alvarez said gently. "I've been teaching for 11 years, Mr. Calloway, and I don't often see a child draw their family with such certainty. Whatever's happening at home, it's working. She feels safe. That comes through in everything she does in this classroom now, her focus, her confidence, the way she talks to other kids. Something changed for her, and you should know it shows." Grant kept that drawing folded in his desk drawer at the office for months afterward. And on the days when the hotel deals felt heavier than they should, when board meetings ran long and the version of himself that measured success in square footage and quarterly earnings threatened to take over again, he would take it out and look at it, and remind himself which version of success had actually mattered. Josie is 9 years old now. She still calls Odessa Miss Odessa, out of habit and affection rather than any lingering formality, and Odessa still hangs laundry in that same backyard, though these days it's rarely just her doing it alone. Grant makes it home for dinner most nights now, a habit he built slowly and deliberately after that first uncomfortable dinner conversation, and the three of them have settled into something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like an ordinary family, if you didn't know the winding, painful, occasionally infuriating road it took to get there. These days, Odessa's sons visit the Calloway house often, and her grandson has claimed a permanent spot at the kitchen island where he does his homework while Josie does hers a few feet away, the two of them bickering companionably about whose turn it is to pick the music. Odessa still drives to Charlotte every few months to see her mother, and Grant makes sure the calendar clears for it without her having to ask twice. She sings in her church choir most Sundays, and once, on a whim, Josie asked to come along, and now the two of them go together most weeks, Grant occasionally joining when his schedule allows, sitting a little stiffly in an unfamiliar pew, learning hymns he didn't grow up with, watching his daughter mouth along to words she'd learned faster than he had. Grant's father never fully came around, not in any dramatic way, but he stopped making comments at family dinners, and once, unprompted, he asked Odessa how her sons were doing, a small gesture that meant more coming from him than either Grant or Odessa expected. Diane, to everyone's surprise, became one of Odessa's more consistent allies over the following year, showing up occasionally to help with school events, the two of them forming an unlikely, careful friendship built slowly out of one honest apology. Sometimes the people who matter most in our lives don't come with the credentials we think we're supposed to be looking for. Sometimes they come quietly, carrying a tray through a side door, showing up night after night without being asked, loving without waiting for permission or recognition, until one day a child reminds the whole room what actually matters. And if we're lucky, if we're paying attention, we finally have the courage to see it too. It's easy, watching a story like this from the outside, to focus on the drama of it, the gala, the laughter, the confrontation at the dinner table. But the real story was never really about any single dramatic moment. It was about 2 years of small, quiet choices, a woman who kept showing up when nobody was asking her to, and a father who finally slowed down long enough to notice who had been holding his family together while he wasn't looking. Most of us will never stand in a ballroom full of people laughing at something we don't yet understand, but most of us have, at some point, walked past somebody who mattered more than we realized. Too distracted, too busy, too certain, we already knew what mattered to notice them standing quietly in the corner of our own lives. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Grant should have made that change sooner, or do you think it took exactly the moment it needed to take for him to finally understand what his daughter already knew? Have you ever had someone in your own life who showed up for you quietly, without a title, without recognition, in a way that mattered more than anyone with an official role ever did? I want to hear about that person in the comments, because stories like this only mean something when we start telling our own. And if this story reminded you that the people who truly show up for us rarely look the way we expect them to, stick around, because next time I'm going to tell you about a young man who was written off by his entire family until one late-night phone call revealed exactly why the woman everyone dismissed had been the only one who ever believed in him. If you don't want to miss it, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.